We have with us two brilliant poets from America, Vijay Sheshadri and Jeffrey Yang, both of whom claim a multicultural heritage, which seems to be under threat in the new America that is taking shape. And we'd like to hear what they think about this situation in relation to their position as writers, as poets, as a teacher, as an editor. So I'll start. You have the mic in your hand. So I'll start with Jeffrey here on my right. He has published several volumes of poetry. He has won awards from PEN, and he has been an editor with New Directions, and he was associated with the New York Review of Books, I believe. So he's an all-round man of letters. I'd like to start by asking a simple biographical question. So how did you become an American? Were you born there? Your family? And where did they come from? And how did they become American? So let's start with that, okay, and then see how.
That sounds good. Hello. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's an honor to be here with Vijay. So my parents both emigrated from China to the U.S. in the 60s separately. They married when they were in the U.S. So I was born in California, Southern California, and had lived there, grew up there. Have also lived in China after I graduated from college, but that's pretty much how I came to, to be in the U.S.
Yeah. So, tell us something about, your entry into the world of writing. When did you start writing?
No, I didn't start really writing until college. High school with friends, I played around a lot with lyrics, and songs and things. But I hadn't even really met a writer until college. So I grew up in a suburb in Southern California called Escondido, and there wasn't really much of a book culture there. So I didn't start until really college and seriously later on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, all your books, I think, appeared over the last, say, 5 or 6?
Maybe 2008.
From 2008 onwards,
yeah.
So it's, But you are quite prolific.
Not really. Interesting. I translate too, and so yes. I've have a few books of translation of different things from the Chinese.
From the Chinese.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's not directly related to Trump, but I'd like to ask you about translation.
Okay, sure.
You've translated Chinese poetry.
Yes.
And any prose?
The new book I translated come out next year. It's a autobiography by a Chinese poet named Bei Dao, who is still alive. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep, but mostly poetry. Yeah. Classical and a book of more modern. Yeah.
Okay. And do you face any problems in bridging the two languages? And how do you see yourself in relation to the tradition of translation from Chinese, which has, we have start with Pound and Arthur Waley.
Yeah,
So a large part of modern English poetry is actually a tradition of translating from Chinese into English. Cathay is a classic of modern poetry in English.
Yes, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And how do you see yourself in relation to that tradition and your forebears in the act of translating, let's say?
Yeah, no, that book and Pound's translations in general have been really pivotal for me. And going from him to Kenneth Rexroth and Gary Snyder, and all these people were very involved in translating Chinese poetry. I mean, I grew up speaking Chinese in the household, and there was, you know, we would, as my sister and I, we would memorize poems here and there, Chinese Tang Dynasty poems. But I mean, seeing the translations of Pound was definitely a revelation to me. I mean, what translation could do with the language. So, and I see that as, I mean, he's definitely in mind when in translating classical poetry.
It's interesting that even in India, in Indian poetry in English, we have at least two poets, or two or three actually. The first modern poet writing in English from the subcontinent, a man called Shahid Sarwardi. He translated the selected poems of a Chinese poet, I forget the name, but which came out in the 1940s. And then Vikram Seth, I think, has translated some. Vikram Seth has done some translations from Chinese. That's interesting. So before we move on to the political angle, I'd like to ask this same question to Vijay. I mean, that which is your the biological. I'm sorry, biographical.
I read lots of Chinese. I love cafe too.
All of us do. So could you tell us about your Americanization?
Yeah, my father came to America in 1955 from Bangalore to get his PhD. He got his PhD, and this was right after I was born, and he came back in '59, and he picked my mother and me up and took us to Canada. And in 1961, we came to Columbus, Ohio, which is right at the center of Ohio's, the state of Ohio, which proved to have such a fatal sort of role in this election, you know. And but I want to defend the state of Ohio, you know, and I think they were lied to, and because those jobs are never going to come back.
Yeah.
And that's one of the kind of interesting facts. And yeah, I kind of, well, the interesting thing about my Americanization in relationship to the election is that after I got over my shock, and I really had a strong urge to get back to America and, you know, and fight for my Americanness in some way, and I feel that sort of very strongly, and I'm eager about it, you know, because I think one of the things about America that's interesting is that it does constantly remake itself, and that produces a lot of anxiety, but it's a process of constant revision by which the country always renews itself, and I think there's a great confusion now. You know, the thing about Trump is that a lot of people say about him that, you know, he lied, that this is some sort of aberration in the normal process of American political life. Actually, he struck some very, very deep roots. You know, he was very instinctive about certain anxieties, and he burrowed into them, and you know, and he was just sort of improvising, but he struck gold in so many cases, and I think like this is a new reality, and one of the things I have to say is that it's not going to be boring in the way that the Hillary, you know, the Hillary first term would have been. Yeah, the Hillary first term would have been the Obama third term. I mean, you know, and but this is something really new, and
very hopeful and positive.
What? I like that. Well, yeah, make it new, right? That's
make
what
it
Pound
new.
said.
Make it new, absolutely.
And,
can I?
Pound was a fascist too.
Yes.
We've got Pound. We've got, you know, maybe we'll have, you know, readings of Cafe in the White House now.
Yeah. Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
You mentioned the America, you know, reinventing itself. So, I mean, how many phases do you see till now? I mean, in that sort of process of...
oh, I think I've been through at least one major transformation in my lifetime. And that was really the 1960s. And then there was a tremendous sort of dialectical reaction to that, which was the Reagan presidency. And in some sense, we've been working out those issues. And we always thought the epical thing was the election of Barack Obama as the first African-American president and the breaking down of that racial barrier. I suspect when we look back historically, we'll see that as an aberration, you know, as in some sense a product of the fallout of the Iraq War, you know, and that the real underlying tension was globalization. And globalization is kind of irreversible. And people don't really realize how big and powerful a thing it is. And they can't quite stop it. You know, I mean, Bangladesh is a part of the economy that America is a part of, you know. I mean, Bangladesh is dependent upon America, and America is dependent upon Bangladesh in all these ways.
So, I mean, globalization is, again, a kind of right-wing. It has taken the whole globe towards the right. I mean, if you say Britain, I mean, the New Labour was, you know, a kind of new conservative party. So you have... right-wing, we have Le Pen, Marine Le Pen in France.
But you know, I mean, I think in terms of Americana, which is what this is supposed to be about, you know, America really has the capacity to absorb this in a way that other countries don't. The countries of Europe have a rigidness that comes from the fact that they're so old, those societies. You know, America is still a young and flexible society. And I think that, you know, I mean, I feel it's a disaster in very specific ways that Trump has gotten elected. It's a disaster for the issue of climate change, which might be the biggest issue the world is facing right now. You know, and that's really terrifying. And it's sort of a disaster for certain internal legislative issues in America, having, for example, to do with abortion and with, you know, women's rights and stuff like that. But I don't necessarily feel that macrocosmically it's disastrous because, you know, the country is grappling with these fundamental realities and changes. And I think eventually it can resolve them, but it's not going to be easy.
But it's actually, I mean, there's been a really conspicuous change in collective political behavior. I mean, after the election of a president, I don't think ever before were there large-scale protests against the election of a certain president. This is something unprecedented. You know? It's something we have in Bangladesh often, but you know, it's so. I mean, and this could be the beginning of a new kind of form of politics, where, you know, in other words, the democratic framework that had existed till recently, it seems to be cracking up. So, you know? I mean, people would say, okay, well, the elections are over, now let's get on with life. It's fine, we'll have a new president. But now there are people out in the streets, you know, all over America, sort of agitating against the new president before he has even taken office. I mean, do you think that it might be the beginning of a kind of civil strife, as it were?
What do you think, Jeffrey?
Civil strife?
Is it the beginning of the end?
No, I mean, I think that's one of the great things too about the U.S. is these places where these protests really do make a difference. Especially, it's the best of the universities. You know, you're seeing these students come out and oh, you want me to get that? But I mean, there's already an enormous march being planned for the inauguration in January, Million-Woman March, and people are already planning the logistics. You know, so I think to me that's very encouraging, and I think it's also encouraging, you know, how kind of what Vijay was referring to is that people will really respond to it in real political ways in trying to affect. You know, the amount of attention and that everyone is going to pay attention to every move he makes and the whole cabinet makes. I think it'll be interesting, you know, to see what, okay. You know, and I don't think people are going to sit around for it. So, yeah.
So in other words, a kind of popular pressure will maybe sort of kept up.
Hopefully.
To sort of,
yeah.
Which may change his behavior and
or
for
Congress.
the better.
I mean, yeah. I mean, let's see what you know. But,
do you see seems to be immune to change, though. That's the interesting thing, you know. I mean, he doesn't deviate. It's really interesting. I don't know how many in the audience are Shakespearean readers of Shakespeare, but there's a play by Shakespeare called Coriolanus. Yeah. And this guy is Coriolanus. Coriolanus is this kind of incredible warrior who has an extraordinary tragic foolishness to him, but he's really strong. I mean, he's just, you know, I mean, he just knows how to fight and fight and fight, and Trump has that quality. It's just amazing, you know. I mean, I can't believe it. I'm trying to avoid the Times, but I, like, you know, got on my laptop this morning and I read it, and it's obvious that the transition is just falling apart into chaos. But, you know, he claims it's all going beautifully and smoothly and stuff like that. And I'm sure he believes it. I mean, he's sort of, you know, I mean, there's chaos around it, but he seems to live in it in this extraordinarily self-possessed way. I mean, it's, you know, as a kind of example of human psychology, I've never really seen anything like it. You know, I would like to say, well, he's an American type, but I don't think we've ever seen his type before, you know? Like this amalgam, this person is made out of social media, reality television, and a series of failed business ventures out of which he made, you know, he made money out of failure for so long, you know, by turning over loans and stuff like that and bankruptcies, and, you know, it's just really astonishing.
Yeah, there was
a profile. What's your take on his sort of his personality?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of past pieces about Trump have come back from archives, and he did a reporter did in the early '90s a profile of him, which he ended up really hating. I think he even the journalist was a woman in some party. He poured a glass of wine down her back without. Yeah. But there's a line in there that in the article. It's kind of amazing where she's interviewing one of his lawyers, and his lawyer says, "Oh well," just like this passing comment. "Oh well, Trump is a big subscriber or is a subscriber of the big lie theory, meaning that the more you say something, eventually people will think it's true. So saying something again and again, and that's kind of what he does all the time, you know, throughout his campaign. But I mean, what's also, what's frightening too is the vice president. I mean, Mike Pence, you know, is another kind of politician, definitely more a smoother, you know, more seasoned kind of politician. But his views and what he represents is even in ways worse than Trump. I mean, as far as even really denying climate change. I mean, all these things, you know. And so I think there's these layers. And he also claimed his hero to be Cheney, you know, Dick Cheney. So I think there's a lot to be concerned with there too. So
one thing that seemed to be happening is that the Republican establishment, or the political establishment, has started trying to tame Trump, as it were. Do you think, they'll go far with that? I mean, is it
I don't quite know how no one knows. The anxiety comes from the fact that no one knows. The anger is separate from the anxiety, but it's sort of it's being fueled by the anxiety to a certain extent. And we're really in an unprecedented situation. We really, and America has been in crisis before. This summer, usually every summer I read a Civil War book. And this summer I read David Herbert Donald's biography of Lincoln, the great biography, and the one-volume biography, and I hadn't read a biography of Lincoln since the Oates biography in the 1980s, and I was sort of fascinated by the fact that the world was falling apart around Lincoln, but Lincoln was coherent. And the contrast here is that the world is fairly okay, at least for America. I mean, America's doing well. The chaos resides within the president-elect, and that's just, I can't think of a moment in American history where it's been like that. Mm-hmm. And I think, it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be.
Do you feel personally threatened in any way? I mean, not literally, that new pressures will be brought to bear? And how would it affect your writing?
No, I mean, I don't think personally, no. I mean, I don't. I'm fortunate to be a citizen, and I have a steady job, and and I've, but I've already heard instances of just this kind of public voicings of against minorities. We've been hearing more of that. I think that will become more common. Yeah. Personally, I mean, I'm not.
But you think it might sort of make it writers in your situation, would they feel that in their writing they should, under this kind of pressure, prove themselves to be truly American? What I mean?
I don't think. I don't know. I mean, it's too early to tell. I mean, he hasn't even been in office yet. I mean, but I don't feel like that's. No, I don't feel like it's going to be a pressure to change, how or what I write in a way. Yeah.
Do you?
No. No. I mean, I think there will be a kind of hostility towards immigrant communities and minority communities that hasn't existed. There will be kind of, the whole issue of policing in African American communities is going to get more contentious and raw. And there have been incidents, I don't know like how accurate the stories are, but there have been a lot of stories of kind of, people being told to go home, Asians, Chinese, Indians, and the thing about it is, and the problem for America can be encapsulated in this simple fact that 8% of the doctors in India, in America now, are of Indian origin. And that's not the rest of South Asia. That's not Bangladesh, that's not Pakistan, that's not Sri Lanka, that's not Bhutan, that's not Nepal, just of Indian origin. And that's a kind of privileged job in the society. And the Indian doctors are everywhere. They're in every small community, There's a statistics I read, I can't remember quite what it is, but I think it's over 50% of the hotel rooms in America are owned by Indians.
Mm.
The small hotels, the motels, like all over the country and stuff like that. That's a huge change that's occurred. I mean, I think when I was listening to your panel, somebody mentioned the fact that a city near Wilkes-Barre, I think it's Hazleton, which, has become 50% Hispanic over the course of the past 20 years. And I think Hazleton was famous because the mayor of Hazleton promulgated an ordinance and tried to get the city council to pass it, and the ordinance said that landlords could not rent their property to undocumented people, and stuff like that. So those sort of issues are going to play themselves out, and they're going to be difficult and complicated, and the society's going to have to deal with it, and we're going to have to find a way to deal with it, because the possibilities of violence are definitely there. And so I don't know what, I don't know what's going to happen, but, maybe everything will calm down after a while. And Trump will just provide us, like, a clown show for the next 4 years. That would be the best thing, that, like he'd send out tweets and everybody will be waiting for his midnight tweets, from the White House. When he's in the White House and not in Trump Tower, because he says he's going to spend a lot of time in New York, which will be great for us, right?
I mean, I think also this the election has also brought more attention. I mean, in the past, through Obama's terms as well, there really are very poor pockets of poverty in the U.S. And I think, I was just reading one piece that came out right around the election or right after, about this Indian reservation in South Dakota called Pine Ridge Reservation. Something like 10,000 people live in this enormous acreage of land, but it's just amazing how completely ignored these people are living without. Many of them live without water, without electricity. Some of them being interviewed in this article I read didn't even care about what the election turned out because they've already been kind of forgotten in a way. And so, hopefully things like that will actually become more aware of and start to change as well. Because I think part of the election too was a response to this kind of poverty as well, or different people's response to it.
And so far in your work, to come back to your poetry, has politics had any impact in the American problems, social issues, or related issues? Like, say, you mentioned the importance of climate change today as a global issue. It's related to, it is political. It's also, it touches every aspect of our lives. And this sort of thing does have an impact on poetry. If you look at the whole tradition of poets who are ecologically conscious and all that. So, how has the problems that are typically American, or which have been exacerbated by the nature of American civilization, because it's that certain things like global warming and making a hole in the ozone layer, the contribution of America is probably more than that of the rest of the world combined.
I mean, does it come into the writing?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I think for both, I could say, reading Vijay's work, I mean, I think everything becomes part of the fabric of poetry, I feel like, and that's one of the wonderful things about poetry is how it could be concerned with so many different disciplines and concerns and still manage to cohere in how it's in the structure and the form. And so, no, I think inevitably all of this comes into play even through what either the writing or the translating or even the editing, I think it all comes a part of it,
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah, I mean, the poem is about the human being, and the human being is a social creature, and a lyrical creature, and also an animal, and all those things. Yeah. I mean, it's really. How can you avoid it? And it's so interesting, right? It's such good material. I kind of, a lot of political stuff that I used to get indignant about, I now really look at and I say, wow, that's a good idea for a poem. So, like, bring it on, bring on the darkness, right? We're the last people who can do something with that. Everybody else, like, cowers in despair, but we sit there and say, despair is mother's milk to us.
Okay. Would you like to read something?
Well, maybe we should take some questions since, we don't have that much more time. Want to do that?
Yeah.
20 minutes.
Do you guys have any questions?
Questions, anybody?
There will be questions, but could you, do you think you could read a few lines from your work? Because,
Well, are there any questions? Yeah. Somebody has a question. Good.
All of you, the panels, have spoken very well. I lived in Arizona for like several years, like more than 4 years. So it's a predominantly Hispanic and white American and some few probably Indians, if you will. And very few probably African Americans. And then I lived in New York City, which is predominantly, cosmopolitan. If you are Indians, and then there are whites and there are Jewish people living side by side with Muslims, and Christian lending their church to let the Friday congregation in many Baptist church allowed that for a rent, for that matter. But when I lived there, I lived in until 2009, and I came back to this country, my home country. I even back then, when I was there, I saw Obama getting elected. I was a polling agent in one of the voting centers. And, when I was allowing that white senior elderly citizens, when they were coming to vote, I was assisting them, and they were telling me, and they were all Republicans, in Arizona. I saw them, and they were all the questions that were, like public questions in all election ballot in the United States. There are questions like propositions, So the propositions which favored the, the minority, in Arizona probably still the majority view, and they were supporting, the way they voted Trump. So there were early signs that Trump is coming long ago, like back in Reagan era. We did not pay attention to it, overlooked at it, because the academic persons and those who writes about politics try to give the centrist view.
So is
fear,
that a question? Do you have a question?
My question is that how long we are going to overlook not the popular or the press views of what is happening in America, rather than the people who see from outside, right? For example, Arundhati Roy or Chomsky, for that matter, that what is going to happen? I mean, when are we going to address it to the real fear, which seems to be coming true as day marches on before our eyes? And when are we going to write poetry about it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that towards the end of the last panel, there's somebody who was talking about, the failure of media, and I think that question got kind of passed over because of the time. But I mean, I think this relates to it. And one of the things that I was thinking about was in this election was just because of how the media was predicting the election to go, there was a real failure of kind of punditry in media, where these talking heads always just kind of throwing out the latest poll number or just being very reactionary. And I think that really has been shown to be a failure in how we look at news, rather than looking at a more deeper historical view, like you were talking about. I mean, I think one of the few people he came up with a 15-question thing in the 80s with a scientist about how to predict the next president, and he's been right every year since 1984 or something. And he was the Alan Lichtman, and he was saying he had his poll was showing Trump as well, or his questionnaire, but he also was saying this is an unprecedented election as well. But I think looking deeper into the issues in history, I think that's one thing, another thing that people hopefully are realizing more too, because you can't just believe everything you're hearing with the way things are polled, or even Nate Silver, so.
Yeah.
Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to respond to that, in that, but I will pull out one sliver and say, well, in relationship to the land we are in right now and the subcontinent that we are in right now, there is not in America a history of what is here called communalism. That there has been racial violence in America, but it always has to do with the integration of communities into a whole. And, and I think America is going to resolve this issue. I mean, I don't, communal tensions in South Asia have always been horrible, and they've never gone away. They've never gone away in any of these communities. They've never gone away in any of these countries. I mean, look at India, I mean, it's like, I mean, and I don't really think, there have been a lot of changes taking place, and people are unnerved and upset by changes. But if you'd had the equivalent kind of changes in a lot of the rest of the world, you would have had conflagrations, And you did not have that in America. You had an election in which a certain kind of nostalgia for something that never existed was expressed, I think the Germans have a wonderful word for that. Like the Germans always have these great words for things that, a specific word for a nostalgia for something that never existed, and the feeling of nostalgia. And that, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see. Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see whether America can absorb this and move on. And kind of maintain its sort of destiny and its... And I have to say that people like myself and Jeffrey, I think, are important to that. That we go there. I mean, I think it's more important to me to now say, I mean, I think I gave an interview to the Dhaka Tribune in which, and Runya, who I think is in the audience, asked me to inscribe it in her book. And the quote she asked me to inscribe was, I don't know if I'm an American, but I do know I'm an American poet. But now I sort of feel like, well, no, I do know I'm an American, I mean, if Trump poses the challenge and says, well, you're not an American, I say, yes, I am an American. Right. And it's not just that I've been there since Eisenhower was president. It's something more. It's kind of, it's an understanding of what it means to be an American, what it means to take on that kind of identity, and what the nature of that identity is. Is it an ethnic identity? No, it's not. It's not. And it shouldn't be. It's not in the nature of the country. And it hasn't been that way since Whitman. you know. Whitman called America a teeming nation of nations, right? And that was the Whitman-esque idea, and he established the social bond in the same way that the founding fathers established the social structure.
Right. And you can still confidently affirm that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and that's really important and central.
There's another question.
I would disagree with your positing that communalism and the violence with communalism in South Asia is terribly different from racial violence in America.
Yeah.
I think they're both identity driven, and
Sure.
I think racism or communalism results in institutionalized discrimination in South Asia and America. And I think the elections in India also went a similar way. So I actually think that there's more similarities there. But the question I had for you was on cultural appropriation and how, and Lionel Shriver's speech on that. And maybe I'm doing a bit of it myself by asking this of you as an Asian American, as an Indian American. But do you feel a particular burden? Do you feel a particular restriction in doing poetry? To me is so deeply personal and also universal. So do you sort of struggle with, can I be another voice? Do I have to represent a particular person?
Yeah, I don't struggle with it at all. I've been told I should. Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you a story if you're interested. When my first book came out, Wild Kingdom, I was invited to read with Shashi Tharoor, who was in New York working for the UN then. And for those of you who don't know, he's a novelist who is now a Congress Party, you know, Buzurg. But he was there in New York, and we were both asked to read by a group called the Network of Young Indian Professionals. The Network of Young Indian Professionals were made up of 20 and 30-somethings in New York City in the 90s who were either, you know, were born in India and grew up here, or were the children of Indian immigrants. And they all had good jobs in the city. They were in finance, they were lawyers, they were doctors. And the organization was basically a pickup scene. You know, that like they had parties and they got together and, you know, and they sort of coupled in one way or another. But because they were a part of an immigrant community, and immigrant communities tend to be high-minded, they would program something high-minded before their parties. And, you know, we were asked to give a reading, and there was this kind of, you know, and then they'd go and, like, party and pick each other up or do whatever they do. I mean, I don't think Indians have sex outside marriage, and South Asians don't do that, so I don't know how far it went, but, you know, they were unmarried. But anyway, like, there was a Q&A afterward, and there was this young lady got up, and she was a journalist. And she said very challengingly, with a great hostility in her voice, "There's nothing about India in your work." And this book mostly takes place in the Pacific Northwest, and, you know, and a lot of it takes place in the fishing and logging industries of the Pacific Northwest, and where I was when I was young. And I said something I thought was brilliant. I said, India in my work functions like God in Pascal's universe. It is everywhere present, but nowhere apparent. And that shut her up. Like, what? Yeah. And so, like, that's the way I feel. Well, you know, India is always there, so you can't see it, but you can't see it. So, you know, I don't have to represent, you know. And, you know, and I sort of do feel that that's true. You are what you are. You don't have to worry about it anymore. You don't have to sit there and say, well, I have to do something that will establish in a conscious way my solidarity with a certain community, you know. In fact, your being who you are as a writer and delving deeply into whatever it is that you are obsessed by as a writer will allow you to be more representative of your community than anything else can. And of course, you know, fundamentally our community is everyone, right? You know, everyone who lives. And so, yeah.
Would you also like to respond to this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I kind of feel the same way, that as far as the cultural appropriation, anything is up for grabs. I think everybody steals from everybody, and it just depends on how it's done. I mean, I think the problem comes because historically you mostly see, you know, white male authors stealing from everybody else. But I think it's at this point, I think it's very significant not to feel burdened, or not maybe feeling the tension, but or a burden perhaps, but not being afraid to use what you need to use for a given, you know, what you're trying to do with your art or with your writing.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I feel about that. But
yeah, I mean,
with respect.
I mean, I think it's interesting in relationship to the issue of communalism, you know, where in India anyway, I don't know exactly what political theory has been like in Bangladesh, but in India, a lot of the sort of state-driven ideas about the communal situation derive from the theory of a composite culture. That's what Nehru called it, right? In some way. And there's a kind of notion that these communities have to have their internal freedom and their internal integrity and solidarity, you know. And, you know, and I guess I would disagree with you in turn about communalism. You know, it's not that there isn't violence in America and hasn't been racial violence. Of course there has been, you know. I mean, America is kind of defined and determined by the fact that, like the three great races of the world, the Asiatic race in the form of, you know, the indigenous American people, you know, the African race and the European race, you know, met on this continent, you know, and encountered each other. And the bloodshed it's written in American history, you know, and the repression and all of those things. But it isn't, but, you know, the idea of the American Republic was always one of unification, right? It wasn't the idea that there was going to be a composite culture. It was that we were all going to be Americans. And the issue always had to be, well, you say we're all going to be Americans, but we're not getting the full rights of the Americans. And so people were struggling for that. But for African Americans, for Asian Americans, for American Indians, as opposed to Indian Americans, you know, it was always the issue of not being given those rights that were promised, you know, on the basis of citizenship. That once you had citizenship, you had these rights. And that's kind of different than, say, if you look at India, if you look at family law in India, there are different, you know, there are different laws for different communities, you know, and that's kind of a crucial recognition of a certain sort of disintegration in the society, that we're not going to have one secular law for everyone, but the family law for Muslims is going to be different than the family law for Hindus. And, you know, and that's not, you know, like in America, everybody's supposed to be under the same law. And, you know, and I think Trump might be ushering in communalism in a way that America has never experienced it, you know. Certainly he wouldn't be, if he was ushering in violence, it would be nothing new, because that's certainly happened. Yeah, I agree with you totally on that. But,
hi.
Yeah. Oh.
My name is Saki from Dhaka Tribune. Author and journalist Chris Hedges said that there's going to be a period of calm after the Trump presidency. And once people who support him realize that he's not going to really fulfill the promises, there's going to be potentially, and he says definitely great unrest. Do you think that's probably going to happen, and what sort of role people like you play? Does that reflect in your work? Do you feel, where is the line between activism and being a writer?
I don't know. What do you think, Jeffrey?
Yeah, unrest. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to know exactly. I mean, I think a lot of the promises he made aren't going to be fulfilled. How the people react to it, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, for your other part of your question, I mean, I work as an editor at 2 publishing houses. I think everyone who has a job, and is also feeling strongly against, what's going on in the political world. They try and do as much as you can that's concrete. So for me, it's a lot of kind of local things in my town, or just trying to participate and outside of as much as I can outside of my job. But I also feel what I do is part of the kind of bringing books from all over the world and trying to get them published. That's in itself is a struggle at times, financially and in other ways. And so I feel like that's, in a way, I could play a role there. That's helpful.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting, and I don't think our roles, we're going to find our roles. It's really new. It's good. It's kind of, sort of excited to get back.
I think we've come to the end of
yeah. So
almost.
I think, are we done?
Any more questions? Maybe
Any more questions?
one more, perhaps, before we
One more.
let you out. Yes.
Thank you for being here. My question might not be that much relevant to today's discussion that much. Sorry for that. My question is about Donald Trump's presidential slogan this time. Donald Trump has used his slogan, "Let's make America great again." And although, as far as I know, this slogan has been used by Ronald Reagan and President Bill Clinton, respectively in 1980 and 1991. But Donald Trump has claimed that he quoted this slogan for the first time ever. But my question is, what would he possibly mean by using the word again? And how do you explain that? Thank you.
Well, I think it was a simple racial code that, America wasn't great because Obama was president, and it had lost its greatness because we had elected an African-American leader. I mean, I think that was the underlying implication of that slogan, and I think Obama would have said, and I think he did say at some point in his convention speech, well, we are great. We don't have to be great again. We're already great, but that was an effective plea. I mean, you really have to see it in terms of the racial politics of America, and I don't know if that slogan has ever been used before. I mean, Reagan's slogan was "Morning in America," and his idea was that we had been through a dark period in the 1970s, and now the sun was rising, and he happened to be the sun, and I can't remember what Clinton's.
Yeah, neither could I.
Yeah.
Clinton, did he have one?
I don't know. I'm sure he did. They've all got to have a slogan,
But also, I mean, to add to that, I mean, Trump's whole campaign has been noted frequently. It was all run on negatives, on everything negative, and his slogan was just part of that as well. He had no real plan and nothing really positive to say. Everything was a negative, and so I think that's part of that.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we
Oh,
actually
thank you.
drove most of our audience away with